one of the biggest consequences of this year of COVID pandemic should be a lasting change to attitudes in relation to the Chinese government. Now, for years, China's leaders were the acceptable face of communism. As long as we didn't look too hard or ask too many tough questions, it meant a gold rush, didn't it, for Australia? Vast numbers of Chinese migrants who were invariably hard-working and law-abiding. Floods of Chinese students and tourists, transforming our universities into corporations and many businesses into great successes. And of course, the almost endless expansion of our exports, from iron ore to coal to gas to dairy and of course to wine, with the promise of rivers of gold as the hundreds of millions of Chinese still out of the middle class came into it. And sure, there were some worrying blips on the radar, like the mistreatment of minorities, the militarisation of the South China Sea, tensions with Hong Kong and Taiwan, and the crackdown on corruption that looked more like a witch hunt against President Xi's internal critics. None of that really impacted the Australian public, who quite understandably preferred to be optimistic rather than pessimistic about our biggest trading partner. But that's now all under a cloud. Some might even say it's in tatters, but I don't believe we're at that stage yet. But it may not be far off. First, there was this virus that the Chinese government covered up and lied about, and that swiftly plunged much of the world into fear and paralysis. Then there was China's hysterical reaction to Australia's perfectly reasonable call for an independent investigation into the origins of this pandemic, something that was unanimously supported, I might remind people, by the World Health Organization, even by China itself. But something that China has never forgiven Australia for advocating, even though it's simply common sense and good practice to want to know what happened in Wuhan and why. Since then, China's retaliation has been swift and targeted at our trade and economic vulnerabilities. So not only do we have a succession of arbitrary and capricious trade boycotts, like our barley being halted on spurious quarantine grounds, our coal being stopped on spurious environmental grounds, and now our wine being hit on spurious anti-dumping grounds. But we've also had successive rhetorical assaults from so-called wolf warrior Chinese officials, like being described as chewing gum on China's boot. And notoriously, of course, we've had this week's post from a senior Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman denigrating the reputation of our military. Where it serves China's interests, China will keep buying from us. Let me tell you, wherever it can, without damaging itself too much, China will keep trying to punish Australia for being an ally of America and for being a country that won't turn a blind eye to injustice just because the perpetrator is powerful and can damage us. Now, make no mistake, if China could buy from someone else, it would. And it's trying to develop alternative suppliers in Africa and elsewhere because to the Chinese regime, everything is strategic. Trade gives it economic leverage, and people, especially the business people and MPs with a stake in China trade and diplomacy, give it political leverage that it won't hesitate to use against us. On Monday, there was a rare display of unanimity from our political leaders as they all took issue with the vile Chinese government's propaganda tweet. But today, greed trumped principle when the Victorian Labor Minister, who'd negotiated the state's Belt and Road debt deal with China, refused to say what he thought about, quote, Aussie soldiers are killers smears, and Premier Daniel Andrews defended him. Now, Andrews said that the Minister for Creative Industries had no responsibility for these matters, he said, and that expecting him to show solidarity with Australian Armed Forces was, quote, trivial and a waste of time.
Well, he's got no responsibilities for those matters. He's the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Government Services and Minister for Creative Industries. I haven't. Well, he's the Minister for Creative Industries, Government Services, and the Assistant Treasurer. That's the responsibilities he has. I'm not seeing his comments. I don't know the details of the question that he's asked. I think I've made the government's position very clear.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not prepared to let Daniel Andrews or the Minister Danny Pearson get away with that, given the Australian Defence Force have spent many months mopping up Labor's hotel quarantine mess in Victoria, the very least our soldiers deserve was unqualified support from the Victorian Premier today, and they didn't get it. Now, of the many things this pandemic has drawn to people's attention, it's the power of state governments that surprised many people. I never cease to be amazed at just how many people didn't realise the level of power that sits with our state leaders, even though normally these state leaders get almost no media attention and state government incompetence attracts almost no political punishment. Under our Constitution, foreign affairs is entirely the responsibility of the national government. But that hasn't stopped Daniel Andrews signing onto China's debt trap diplomacy in the hope of getting cheap Chinese money to fund Victorian infrastructure projects. And today, the Victorian Premier even went so far as giving public advice to the PM about how the PM should conduct foreign policy by repairing the relationship with China. Now, surely Andrews knows the only way to avoid being savaged by the Chinese government is to avoid ever doing anything that China doesn't like, which is a supine and servile position that no self-respecting Australian government, state or federal, could or should ever adopt. There's a lot that's become apparent, isn't it, in this COVID year of 2020. The addiction of all governments, but especially state Labor ones, to debt and deficit. The power of bolshy state premiers to unwind the nation we thought we were into a collection of warring and separatist states, and the propensity of our biggest trading partner to bully us. The last thing we need, Australia, are premiers backing Beijing over Canberra.